All right. Let's go on to the Bayern game then. Yes, they are defeated, Stefan. I think the fans that celebrated this the most were Bayer Leverkusen fans. The game wasn't even completely finished yet when the result at Bayern Munich came across the wire at the Bayer Arena, and the Leverkusen fans with the big cheer, because that means that record at least will not be a Bayern Munich record, going through an entire Bundesliga campaign undefeated. Um, yeah, I guess it was going to happen eventually. Although, having seen Bayern Munich play this year, I had given up hope that they would be beaten eventually. They seemed so steady, so very strong. I didn't think that there were many teams that could put up the sort of performance that Arsenal put up in the Champions League. There was moments last week when I was in Leipzig where I thought, especially in the first half, maybe Leipzig were going to do it. But that the last 25 minutes or so where Leipzig completely fell apart kind of made me think, this is a really hard team to beat. But it's now happened. It's also happened against a team where in the first half of the season, the head coach was still Sandro Wagner, and he said, "My team has just as much quality as Bayern Munich." And then people in the dressing room laughed, and he said, "Well, you'll see." So I guess Sandro Wagner is no longer the Augsburg coach, but maybe he was right.
Yeah, well, that's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we obviously joke that Augsburg are the minnows of the Bundesliga and of Bavarian football or the Bundesliga, whatever. But they did put up a really good fight against Bayern at the start of the season, and I did go into this match expecting them to score. I don't know why, but I did, and I have the betting slip to prove it. And I made a joke in the subscriber chat during the game, and indeed after the Augsburg goal, and I said one of the safest bets to put on right now in Bayern Munich games is that both teams will score. In fact, I did check before we came on air here, and they've only kept 2 clean sheets in the last 10 league games, um, and it is quite startling. Now, I mean, I think there's 2 things behind that. Obviously, there's the huge amount of injuries that they have. Obviously today they were playing with Davies and Ito at fullback, and before that, they've had all sorts. They've had Bischoff, and they've had Kimmich, and I mean, I guess Tarek Conrad Leimer is still considered maybe a kind of a midfielder who has been converted into a fullback, even though he does very well at that job. But it's it's an issue that has been there from day one with Bayern, at least since the start of the season, and it is, I guess at this point, it's now kind of coming back to bite them. They're probably one of the few teams in the world that seem to have an abundance of left backs, but no actual right backs. Because if you consider Ito, you've got Davies, you've got Guerrero, you've got Bischoff, so you've got at least 4 guys there who can kind of fill in there. Kimmich obviously wasn't fully fit to start this game at right back, so he couldn't do the role there. So I guess Davies did it. So you've kind of got just very simple numbers of players being injured, and Kompany just not really having too many options there. And you could maybe kind of go all the way back to the start of the season, and question why Bayern didn't do more about that. Obviously, they went into the season with one actual fullback in Sasha Bowie, and as we've reported a number of times in this podcast, he's been injured since he joined Bayern, and he was injured before he joined Bayern. He came to the club with pre-existing conditions, which is why he hasn't been able to play much. And I mean, I guess technically Kompany could say, look, I've got Stanisic there, I've got Konrad Leimer there, I'll be fine. But, injuries to both of them has now meant that, and of course, Bowie being out, as he always is, means that they've struggled there. But I kind of got a bit of heat at the start of the season for saying, Konrad Leimer's not good enough right back for that position. And I do understand that he has done very well for Bayern since then, but it doesn't really get away from the fact that even if Leimer does a decent job there, he's still only one actual fullback for that position. Because I know Stanisic can play that role, and he did it for Leverkusen as well previously, but I don't think of him as a top-class fullback. He's a guy who can do a very good job there for sure, but if I was Bayern, if I was, Max Abel building a squad, I wouldn't be sitting there thinking we don't need a right back because we've got Stanisic, maybe that is what they have done, and that's what they should do. But I think that's the kind of issue So there's just a simple issue of numbers. And then the other issue as well is, I think, just general malaise, general fatigue. We both watched their game against Union Saint-Gilloise in the Champions League in midweek, and we did a show after it. And they looked really kind of lethargic. They looked like they were kind of just going in first gear. They weren't really getting up to top speed. I think if there's another team that had a bit more bite than the Belgian side did, I think it would have caused them some issues. Granted, it was a kind of dead rubber because Bayern were already through, so you don't want to kind of read too much into those performances. But sometimes if you kind of get a bye game like that and no one's really going at 100%, it's actually quite hard to raise yourself a few days later for a game that does matter. And, for a club like Augsburg, this is a cup final. Every time they play Bayern, it's like a cup final. You can tell that they obviously want to win these games. They want to cause an upset. And they almost did it at the start of the season, and they got to do it tonight at the Allianz Arena. So fair play to Augsburg. And now, for the first time, Manu, in 323 days, Bayern have lost a Bundesliga game.
So how many days? 323.
23.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I can say is, and I'm looking at the stats here, the only time I've seen Bayern Munich in trouble this season was when they were outperformed or outworked, right? This was the case when I was in Berlin for the game at the Alte Försterei, where they rescued a late 2-2 draw. And Union Berlin outworked them. And Augsburg outworked them today. They ran a full kilometer more, which in Bayern Munich, when you play against Bayern Munich, means you have to run 124 kilometers. That is, by the way, 10 kilometers more than either Dortmund or Union Berlin ran today. So just to put that in perspective, right? So, and I think this is why it makes it so hard to beat Bayern Munich this season, is because not only do they have more talent, they also work harder than their opponents. Which is, of course, brings us back to the debate that we had at the beginning of the season. How long can you play like that with a squad that isn't as big as, say, like the top Premier League team squads, right? How long can you maintain this consistent style of play where you are not only outplaying your opponent, but also outworking them, while not really relying on a lot of players. And you see that with like Harry Kane, for example, right? How deep he drops at time. You see it, how much the defenders have to work. And that raises the question: is like, what happens when this breaks down? And so, yeah, I think today Augsburg simply outworked them. And also you need a little bit of luck. Like that situation at the very end where Michael Olise does the Arjen Robben. And he does the Arjen Robben like pretty much as well as Arjen Robben, sometimes even better. But that ball just hits like that very top corner of the crossbar, right? And ricochets out. And that very same situation against Union Berlin, that was a goal, right? Like Harry Kane converted his chance in the very last minute. So eventually that was going to cover to catch up with Bayern Munich too, that moment where they maybe don't get a goal in the very last second. And so we're now in the situation where they have finally lost the game. I'm not sure, we joked around this earlier, like, is that going to make a difference in the title race? I don't think so. I think they're just too consistent, right? Dropping 8 points from here to the end of the season to Borussia Dortmund, and also having Borussia Dortmund not drop points themselves seems a monumental task if you're anyone else. But I do think it is a warning sign as Bayern Munich transition into the spring, as the games become more, as the championship games become bigger, that there is cracks in how you can beat them. And as fatigue sets in, especially with the Club World Cup in mind as well, I think there's going to be some issues here.
Yeah, I mean, I made a joke on social media about the Bundesliga title race being back up and running because there's only 8 points in it now. But yeah, of course, you're right. I mean, they do have Hoffenheim in a couple of weeks, and then they've got to go away to Dortmund and Leverkusen before the end of the season. So, never say never. But you would suspect that they'd have most of these players back. I'm going to read some of the comments actually we got because I see a few Bayern fans in the chat, and Adidas talk referring to my Stanisic point. It says Stanisic also played in the back five, which is absolutely spot on. It says, is Bayern's outside back absence a surprise susceptibility? The left back, right backs were not great defenders, but in a team like Bayern that who defends on the front foot, and the substitute left back and right back don't contribute to attacking, not defend, and best making Bayern look particularly ineffective. I think I've absolutely butchered your point there, Adita, but I think you're absolutely right. I think in terms of, bringing on guys like Ito and stuff like that, just don't really bring as much as an actual fullback or a wing back, which is absolutely spot on. And I kind of agree with you in terms of Stanisic as well. I think he lacks that as well. Tor says, is it just me or have Augsburg played very, very well versus Bayern in the last 2 years? Yeah, we touched on that. Obviously, did very well at the start of the season. And he also says, this is the only thing that could kill this Bayern season is the injuries, and the difference in injury amount between Dortmund and Bayern is insane. And yeah, it's absolutely spot on. And I think what we have to maybe touch on here in terms of the injuries is because we both have Bayern fans being like, what is going on? Why are we cursed? Why is this team suddenly cursed? And we don't really know what's going behind closed doors. Maybe there's too many potholes at the Bayern training ground or something. I don't know. But
I
I
think it's
think,
the work rate, Stefan.
well,
Like,
yeah, of course, the work rate. But the point I was going to make was it's also the tiny squad. Like these guys will
yeah,
be the workload in their legs will be so much more than the likes of Dortmund players or other teams in the Champions League, obviously, because they've got players who can rotate in and out of the team. I mean, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but I reckon if you check which players have got the most minutes in the Bundesliga this season, there'll be a lot of Bayern fans or Bayern players probably at the top of that. But I think the concern isn't just these guys that are picking up injuries. It's the fact that the guys who are stepping in simply aren't good enough. And I think tonight, and I think the midweek game was a good example of two players who really stand out to me here. Kim Min-jae and Leon Goretzka. So, I mean, we can talk all night about the lack of fullbacks, and it's absolutely spot on, but I can't remember the last time Leon Goretzka had a good game for Bayern Munich. And I think he's kind of developed into this role of being, I think when he was at his absolute best, he was the best box-to-box midfielder in the world, or one of the best box-to-box midfielders in the world, a player who could obviously get stuck in because he's a physical specimen of a man. He's a gladiator. So he can win headers, he can win tackles, he can shove players off the ball. But, he is at his heart a very technically gifted attacking midfielder. He came through at Schalke as like a number 10, as a playmaker. So in his peak in that Hansi Flick team, he was a player that could do both things. But it just feels to me with Goretzka, he's lost that pace, he's lost that edge, and a player that could do everything very well has suddenly become a player that doesn't really do anything very well. And he kind of sits in that Bayern midfield, and it's hard to tell what he actually does. You can obviously see what Pavlovic is doing, what Kimmich is doing when he's there because he's kind of pulling the strings. But it feels to me like Goretzka is just kind of chasing shadows. He's chasing the game. He's not having a real influence on it. And I think that's a huge problem because when he has to step in for a Kimmich or whoever else, they're in trouble. And of course, Kim Min-jae, who wasn't very particularly good in this game either, who was dreadful in midweek. It feels like he and the club are just kind of killing time until they can go their separate ways in the summer. And that in itself is a huge problem, and I know hopefully when everyone comes back from injury, like someone like Stanisic can kind of come in and take his place in the pecking order at centre back. But I think that's probably one of the reasons behind this performance and the one against Union Saint-Gilloise that, yes, you have your Olises and your Diazes and your Harry Kanes and things like that, but they can only do so much if the guys at the centre of that team aren't doing particularly well. And I always say this, and it's something I do believe, that football's a weak link sport. And what that means to me is that if two teams are well balanced, it's the team with the worst player in their team that will ultimately impact the game. And if Goretzka and Kim just aren't the players that they used to be for one reason or another, then Bayern will continue suffering. And that's a very real consequence of this very small squad and injuries, I think.
So while you were talking, I looked up some of the stats. So Bayern Munich are first in the Bundesliga with 2,353.6 kilometers covered, which is 60 kilometers more than the second team, which is Augsburg.
No, well,
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, right? But it's also the gap between them and Bayern Munich is quite substantial. So Bayern Munich are leading the league there by a lot, which is usually quite uncommon. It's usually teams that fight against relegation that lead the stat. Having said that, they don't have any players in the top 20 for most distance covered. The player
hmm.
that has played that covered the most distance for Bayern Munich is ranked 23rd, and it's Harry Kane, which is actually also
And,
really interesting. Harry Kane is the Bayern Munich player that covers the most distance,
okay.
ahead of Michael Olise and Joshua Kimmich. They have a lot of players that, most teams have like one or two players that like stand out that cover a lot of distance. But Bayern Munich have a lot of players in that middle pack that seem to, so the workload is evenly spread.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, Harry Kane is 23rd with 194 kilometers covered, which is not exactly something you would expect from a center forward. And if you're an England fan and a Bayern Munich fan hoping to be in the later stages of the Champions League and be successful, that is a stat that should worry you.
yeah. And you know what's also interesting, Manu? I'm checking Transfermarkt for players that played the most minutes. And do you know which Bayern players have played the most minutes in the Bundesliga this season? Which
I was Harry Kane and Michael Olise and Luis Diaz, I would say.
Diaz has played the most minutes, followed by Harry Kane, followed by Olise. And only one Dortmund player has played more minutes than those three players, and that's Vladimir Anton and Gregor Kobel, but I'm not counting goalkeepers because
Yeah.
they don't really count. And I think that's really, really telling. I think there's then after those three, you get Nepcha and Svensson, and then it's Jonathan Tah. So you know that I mean, and that obviously makes sense because Bayern have had injuries in midfield and defence, so they have had kind of moved players in. But the fact that those three have played basically as much as they have is impressive and incredible. But it definitely goes to show the kind of folly or the kind of consequences of having this very, very small squad. And, we did say on the kind of, I think it was midweek show, maybe last week, that, look, Davies is returning, Musiala's returning. Musiala obviously played in this game. As the Davies, obviously, things should be all right. But they're going to have a few hiccups from time to time. And, look, a defeat at Augsburg's not the end of the world. It's embarrassing. They've got a bit of egg in their face because they lost at the Allianz Arena. But they've still got an 8-point gap, and they just have to make sure they don't have this number of injuries when it comes to the knockout games, I guess.
I actually almost wonder if like this defeat could be a blessing in disguise because I know that Bayern Munich are consumed by the fact that they don't own the record for being the only team to have won the Bundesliga without a defeat. And so, but now like they can't get that record anymore this season. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So if you can't get it anymore, you might as well bugger off some Bundesliga games here and there in the name of maybe winning the Champions League, right? Because the title is probably secured. And if you can't win the title undefeated, what's the point of smashing opponents 6-7-0 with your best starting lineup every week? So I actually wonder if with that monkey off the back and maybe having to try again next year to finally get the record, or if they're ever going to get it, because it's extremely hard. I mean, there's a reason why Bayer Leverkusen were the first team to ever do this. Um, I wonder if this company is now going to say, well, we can't get that anymore. So, maybe it's time to give Kane a little bit of a rest. It's time to give Michael Olise a little bit of a rest in some of these league games. And
Yeah.
probably something that needs to happen anyways, but now there's maybe more motivation towards doing it. Because I just know the Bayern bosses would want to have that record because they're all consuming. They want every record there is, right? That's how it works. It's literally in the national. It's literally in the anthem. The national anthem. The Bayern Munich song is not the national anthem of Bavaria. Even though Bayern
Thank God.
probably Bayern fans probably believe it should be.
I believe it's one of the most cringiest songs I've ever heard at a football stadium, so I'm glad it's not. But yeah.
But
But
Stefan,
yeah, I
es
mean,
war ein langer, harter Weg.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think we can kind of take this all in context. I think the key thing is that they're in a bit of a rut. They're struggling with form, but they should be okay Bundesliga wise. Like I said, I think they've got a couple of games before they play a team like Hoffenheim, who, by the way, have now got more points than any other team. No, they're level now with Bayern for points won in the last 10 match days in the Bundesliga, which is incredible. Picked up a big win today as well, actually, which unfortunately we won't have a chance to talk about. But they should be fine in terms of kind of, just navigating these kind of troubled waters. And it'll be key to making sure they've got, I mean, I don't know if Konrad Laimer will be back for the group stage or the knockout games, but, Kimmich should be back. Stanisic perhaps will be back. And, Upamecano, importantly, will be back, so I think they're going to be absolutely fine. But, it's nice to see that, they can bleed from time to time and that they aren't immortal.